In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the Reactive Exposure plugin for Lightroom. You can find it at rawplugins.com. Reactive Exposure is a plugin that can help you save a lot of time in your processing and even help you understand more about tonality and exposure adjustments. Reactive Exposure is currently the only plugin on the market that works natively with Lightroom. It is truly a non-destructive Lightroom workflow. It doesn't create any additional TIFF files into your catalog. Instead, all the adjustments are applied directly into Lightroom's tonal and luminosity adjustment sliders. So you can always go back and make adjustments or even sync the adjustments to other files. In this video, I'll spend a little time showing you what the plugin can do and how you can take advantage of its capabilities. So I'm going to be working with this image here. And I want you to pay close attention to the sliders here, the exposure, contrast, highlights, shadow, whites, and black sliders, and also the luminance sliders down here. If I make any adjustments to the exposure, bring the exposure down just a little bit so we can get more detail in the sky, we'll make the rest of the image a lot darker. And that's something that we probably don't want to do for this image. Also notice that by adjusting the slider, nothing else changed. I'm going to click on Reset. And now I'm going to go into the Reactive Exposure plugin. So go into File, Plugin Extras, Reactive Exposure. And that's going to bring up the Reactive Exposure window, which is this one here. And I'm going to click and drag it over to the side so we can look at the image and adjust the sliders and see how they affect the development sliders here in Lightroom. And if we drag the slider over to the left to 1.08, notice that Lightroom makes the same adjustments on the fly here on the right side under Exposure. Now, the difference with Reactive Exposure is that we have this response slider. And when you slide this slider over to the right, the plugin is looking at an algorithm that determines which of the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks can be adjusted. At the same time, it's looking at the luminance values in the HSL to also make adjustments. As I drag the slider over to the right even further, the adjustments get stronger in the luminance values and in the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Also notice that when we have a negative number in the exposure, we get positive numbers in these four sliders and in the luminance sliders here at the bottom. If we drag the exposure slider to the right until we get a positive value, we leave the response where it was. Notice the difference now. We have negative numbers here and we have negative numbers in the luminance values as well. So this plugin allows you to counteract the exposure that you apply to an image to create a better balance. The Reactive Exposure plugin also has this Pro feature here at the bottom, and that allows you to select from this dropdown which of the luminance values you're going to be targeting. For example, default, you target all of them. Warm hues only targets the warm hues. Notice how these sliders now reset to 0 and the warm hues are only being affected. We can also select don't include warm hues, so it's going to create sort of an inverse effect. So these three sliders are now at 0, while the others are reflecting the values applied by the response slider. And of course, you have cool hues, earth hues, and something called hue response only, which makes the changes in the luminance values, but leaves the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks alone. So you can target which of these two sets of sliders you want to adjust. Or you can do no hue response, which is the opposite. The luminance sliders are left intact and the changes only happen in the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. So at this point, I'm just going to reset the response slider to 0. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make an adjustment to the exposure slider. I'm going to leave it at about 1.45. And that way I can use the response slider to bring some detail back. But I only want to affect the cool colors so that I get the sky back, as you can see there. So notice that when I'm dragging the slider over to the right, I'm only affecting these values here, the aqua and blue, which would, in this image, be the sky. And don't let the simplicity fool you. Just by dragging a couple sliders around and selecting one of these drop downs, you have great control over what colors, what luminance values you're targeting in your image, and it's all non-destructive. All the effects are native to Lightroom. So once I press OK, I can come back and decide that maybe I don't want my blues as dark, so I can lighten those up, or I can come and make adjustments maybe to the blacks, shadows, or any of the other sliders. including sliders that were not affected by the Reactive Exposure plugin, like the clarity or vibrance or any of the other sliders. So it makes it really easy for people that are barely learning Lightroom, or for people who just want to save a little bit of time and getting started and making adjustments to their images. Also, as I mentioned before, these effects are native to Lightroom. So any effect that we applied can be copied and applied to any other image, and we're not creating extra files. We're not creating any TIFF files or anything like that. It's all within Lightroom. And to show you the other features of the responsive exposure plugin, I'm going to be using this photograph. And I want you to notice here on her sleeve, we have some chromatic aberration. So if I go into File, Plugin Extras, and Reactive Exposure, notice that by default, the plugin has Enable Chromatic Aberration checked, and that gets rid of the chromatic aberration that we saw. That was that magenta outline right here. I'm going to disable this on the plugin so it comes back, and there you see it, and I'll enable it again to get rid of it. I'm also going to cancel this for now, and I'm going to fit the image to screen, and I'm going to bring up the plugin once again. File, Plugin Extras, Reactive Exposure. And we also have the Enable Lens Profile checkbox, and I'm going to press OK and go into the lens correction, and this is where those changes happen. Remove chromatic aberration. You can make some adjustments here if your image requires it. And under Profile is where you can see the checkbox that the plugin enabled the profile corrections here. And that's how it was before, and this is after. And of course, you can make exposure adjustments to this image. So let me go ahead and just make some adjustments. I'm just going to bring the exposure down just a tiny bit, just so we can get a little bit more detail on the snow in the background. And I'm going to use a response slider and bring that over. Notice the changes here under luminosity and under highlights and shadows. In this case, I probably want to only affect earth hues. So as you can see, we're only affecting these colors here, which include the greens in the background, and I can adjust that accordingly. Also, if you want to make some finer adjustments, instead of clicking and dragging on the slider, you can also use the arrow keys on the keyboard to make the adjustments. When you're done, simply press OK, and you can make any other adjustments like vibrance or anything else that you think your image requires. So I hope that this demonstration gave you a good idea of how the Reactive Exposure plugin works and how you could integrate it into your workflow. If you would like to find out more about Reactive Exposure, then head over to rawplugins.com. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.